The twin suns beat mercilessly over the endless expanse of the desert planet, casting waves of heat that shimmered across the barren land. Captain Elias Voss, a veteran medic from the Galactic Frontier Corps, trudged through the sand, his steps heavy and mind clouded with exhaustion. He wasn't supposed to be here. His assignment was to evacuate soldiers from a nearby battlefront, but something, an unexplainable pull, led him far from the mission route. Just as Elias considered turning back, his gaze locked onto a figure sprawled across the dunes. His breath hitched. It wasn't a human soldier. The delicate frame lying there was like nothing he had ever seen before. The alien girl's skin glowed faintly, her smooth complexion shifting between soft lavender and pale silver under the harsh sunlight. She was draped in tattered clothing, barely enough to shield her from the elements. Her hair, strands of moonlight, cascaded across her shoulders, tangled and matted with sand. The deep gashes across her body revealed wounds that hadn't been treated. Her breathing was shallow, and her violet eyes flickered as if struggling to stay open. Without hesitation, Elias knelt beside her, setting down his med kit. Voice deep inside warned him to move quickly. Desert predators were known to circle anything that looked vulnerable. But as his hands hovered over her wounds, a strange sensation washed over him. A warmth, almost a whisper in his mind, urging him to help. "Stay with me," he whispered, carefully slipping his hands under her. She was light as a feather, yet something about her presence was overwhelming, as though she carried the weight of an entire universe. With no immediate shelter in sight, Elias knew he had to improvise. He carried her towards the shade of a half-buried shuttle wreckage. A relic from an old skirmish, the metal hull offered some protection from the sun, but time was running out. He pulled out his scanner to assess her condition, but the device only emitted static. "What in the stars?" Elias muttered under his breath, frustrated. It was as if the scanner couldn't register her existence. But that didn't deter him. He began treating her wounds manually, wrapping her cuts in bandages, applying salve to prevent infection, and pressing cooling pads against her fevered skin. The girl stirred slightly, her lips parting to murmur something in a language he didn't understand. Yet her eyes, those shimmering violet eyes, spoke a universal plea. "Help me." Elias leaned in closer. "I've got you. You're safe now." But as he spoke, a sudden gust of wind swept through the desert, carrying with it a haunting silence. It was as if the world around them had paused, watching, waiting. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something far greater was at play. As he worked tirelessly to stabilize her, a nagging thought gnawed at the back of his mind. Why had this alien been left here, abandoned, in the middle of a wasteland? And why did he feel as though he was the only person in the galaxy who could see her? The sun dipped lower in the sky, and Elias realized that nightfall was approaching fast. The desert would soon become even more dangerous, and he had no idea what other threats lurked in the shadows. For now, though, all that mattered was keeping her alive. He wrapped her in a thermal blanket, hoping to buy some time until he could get her to a safer location. Her soft breathing steadied as if sensing his intent, and for a brief moment, the weight of his responsibility felt heavier than any mission he had ever undertaken. "Who are you?" he whispered into the growing darkness, but the only response was the faint hum of the wind and the distant call of unseen creatures in the night. The journey was just beginning, and Elias had a feeling that saving this girl was only the first step in an adventure he hadn't signed up for, but one he could no longer walk away from. As the first of the two suns dipped below the horizon, the desert transformed from an inferno into an icy wasteland. Captain Elias Voss huddled beside the alien girl, his hands trembling as he secured the blanket around her fragile form. A chill crept through the air, and with it came the eerie howls of nocturnal creatures stirring from their burrows beneath the sand. Elias leaned against the metal wreckage, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Shadows stretched long and deep, threatening to swallow them both. Despite the eerie silence, Elias could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him, as if the desert itself was alive and curious about his actions. The girl stirred under the blanket, her violet eyes fluttering open once more. She looked up at Elias, a flicker of recognition in her gaze, as if, in the brief time he had cared for her, she had come to trust him. "What's your name?" Elias whispered, hoping to build a bridge between their worlds. The girl's lips parted, her voice barely audible over the night's chill. "Leora." Elias gave her a small nod. "Leora, that's a beautiful name." His words hung in the cold air between them, fragile and sincere. "I'm Elias. I'll keep you safe, I promise." Leora's hand, cool to the touch, rested lightly on his wrist. Her expression shifted, gratitude, relief, and something deeper, something Elias couldn't yet understand. She murmured a phrase in her language, her words lilting and musical. Elias didn't understand them, but the tone was unmistakable. "Thank you." The stillness of the moment was shattered by a sudden, piercing shriek from the darkness beyond the wreckage. Elias froze, instinctively pulling Leora closer. The sound echoed across the dunes. A predator on the hunt. His heart raced, every instinct honed from years of service telling him that they were no longer alone. He scanned the landscape, his hand instinctively reaching for the small plasma pistol holstered at his side. Out here in the desert night, survival wasn't guaranteed. The beasts that prowled the dunes were notorious for their speed and ferocity. Leora tensed against him, as if sensing the same danger. "Stay still," Elias whispered, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. "We'll make it through the night." He knew they had no other choice but to wait until morning. Traveling under the twin moon's pale light was a death sentence. Movement would only attract the predators circling in the shadows. But Elias could feel Leora's body trembling beside him, her energy waning as her wounds sapped the last reserves of her strength. Drawing a deep breath, he wrapped his arm around her, hoping to provide whatever warmth and comfort he could. To his surprise, she leaned into him, trusting him without question. A strange sensation welled up within him. A protective instinct, stronger than anything he had ever felt before. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. The desert night was merciless, dragging Elias and Leora into a battle not with enemies, but with exhaustion, fear, and the cold that seeped into their bones. Yet, in the midst of it all, Elias noticed something remarkable. Leora's breathing, though labored, had begun to synchronize with his. Every exhale she released mirrored his, as if they were connected by an unseen thread. He felt her presence in a way that transcended words, a silent bond forming between two beings who had been thrust into this hostile world. Elias closed his eyes briefly, fighting back the fatigue that threatened to overwhelm him. His mind drifted between wakefulness and dreams, images flashing behind his closed lids. Leora standing on a distant world, surrounded by her people, their violet eyes glowing like stars. His civilization, ancient and peaceful, torn apart by forces beyond their control. When Elias opened his eyes again, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon, casting the desert in hues of gold and rose. Leora stirred beside him, her pale lips curving into the faintest of smiles as the warmth of the rising suns kissed her skin. "We made it," Elias whispered, relief washing over him like a tide. Leora's gaze met his, and for the first time, Elias saw a spark of hope in her eyes, faint but undeniable. It was a fragile thing, this hope, but it was enough to keep them going. He knew they couldn't stay hidden in the wreckage much longer. As soon as the suns rose fully, the desert would become a furnace again, and they would need to find proper shelter. But for now, in this fleeting moment of peace, Elias allowed himself to believe that they could survive whatever came next. "We'll find help," he promised, though he wasn't entirely sure who or what could help them. All he knew was that he wouldn't abandon her, not now, not ever. Leora's hand brushed against his once more, her touch light as a whisper. "Thank you," she said, this time in halting but recognizable galactic basic, the common language of the known worlds. Elias blinked in surprise, a grin spreading across his face despite the exhaustion that weighed on him. "You're welcome," he replied. But even as they shared this small victory, the reality of their situation loomed large. They were alone, stranded in a hostile desert, with predators lurking in the shadows and no guarantee of rescue. Elias knew that their journey had only just begun. The twin suns rose higher, drenching the dunes in an unforgiving wave of heat. Elias wiped the sweat from his brow as he adjusted the pack on his back, securing Leora carefully against him. She was still weak, her head resting on his shoulder. But she was conscious, a small miracle given the severity of her wounds. The desert wouldn't show mercy, and neither could they afford to linger. "We need to find shelter before midday," Elias muttered, glancing across the endless sea of sand. There was no sign of life, no visible landmarks, just a vast, desolate expanse stretching in every direction. The wreckage that had sheltered them during the night was rapidly becoming an oven under the sun's rays. With a final glance at the horizon, Elias adjusted his grip on Leora and began walking. Every step was a battle against the shifting sand, the heat clawing at his skin. But he kept moving, fueled by the knowledge that slowing down would spell disaster. Leora stirred weakly, her hand brushing his arm. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Elias shook his head. "Yes, I do. We both get out of here, together." Her violet eyes flickered open, studying him as though trying to understand why a stranger would risk his life for her. But Elias offered no explanations. He didn't have any. All he knew was that he couldn't leave her behind, not after everything she'd endured. Hours passed as they made their way across the dunes, the blazing sun sapping what little strength Elias had left. His breathing grew labored, every step heavier than the last. But just as his legs threatened to give out, he spotted something in the distance. A faint outline against the shimmering horizon. Shelter. Jagged canyon cut through the desert, its shadowed crevices offering a reprieve from the relentless heat. Elias' heart leaped with hope. "We're almost there," he whispered to Leora, quickening his pace despite the burning in his muscles. They reached the canyon just as the suns reached their zenith. Elias collapsed onto the cool stone floor, carefully laying Leora beside him. The shadows of the canyon walls wrapped around them, offering a brief respite from the heat. For a moment, neither of them spoke, too exhausted to even breathe properly. But as the silence stretched, Elias felt Leora's hand reach for his once more. A simple gesture, yet it carried more weight than words ever could. "Thank you," she whispered again, her voice clearer now. Elias managed a tired smile. "I told you, I'm not leaving you behind." The cool air of the canyon brought Leora some relief, and after a few minutes she sat up slightly, resting her back against the rock wall. Her eyes scanned the canyon with a cautious curiosity, as though searching for something familiar. "This place, it's far from where I was taken," she murmured, more to herself than to Elias. Elias leaned back, resting his head against the stone. "What happened to you, Leora? How did you end up out here alone?" Leora's expression darkened, her gaze dropping to the ground. "My people, we were captured, taken by slavers working for the syndicate. They wanted to sell us, but I managed to escape." Her voice trembled, each word laced with painful memories. "I thought I could outrun them, but they hunted me across the desert. I lost them eventually, but I was so weak, I collapsed." Elias clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath his exhaustion. The syndicate. He had encountered their cruelty before, mercenaries and slavers who preyed on the vulnerable, trading in lives for profit. Knowing they were involved only made Elias more determined to protect Leora. "You're safe now," Elias said, his voice steady despite the anger swirling within him. "They won't find you here." Leora gave him a faint, grateful smile, but it was fleeting. "I can't stay here forever, Elias. They won't stop looking. Not until they capture me, or worse." Elias' mind raced. The desert wasn't safe, but neither was staying put for too long. If the syndicate was involved, they'd have eyes everywhere: scouts, informants, and tracking drones. The canyon would only provide temporary cover. They needed a plan. "We'll find a way off this planet," Elias said firmly. "There's a way out. There always is." Laura's gaze softened, a flicker of hope returning to her eyes. "Why do you care so much?" she asked softly. "Why are you doing this?" Elias hesitated. He didn't have an easy answer, not even for himself. All he knew was that something about Leora, her vulnerability, her strength, the injustice she had endured, compelled him to act. He couldn't explain it. He just knew he couldn't walk away. "Because no one deserves to be abandoned," he finally said, his voice low but resolute. "And I won't let them take you." For a long moment, Leora stared at him, her violet eyes shimmering with emotions too complex to name. Then, without a word, she leaned her head against his shoulder, finding comfort in his presence. The suns continued their slow journey across the sky, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. But for the first time in days, Elias allowed himself a moment of peace, knowing that he wasn't alone, and neither was she. They would figure this out together. The respite in the canyon was short-lived. As the suns dipped lower in the sky, the shadows deepened, and the desert air grew heavy with an unsettling stillness. Elias' instincts buzzed with unease. Something wasn't right. He had been on too many missions not to recognize the eerie calm that precedes disaster. Laura must have sensed it too. She sat upright, her violet eyes sharp as she scanned the canyon's entrance. "They're coming," she whispered, fear tightening her voice. Elias didn't need to ask who. The syndicate. They had found them. "Can you walk?" he asked urgently, grabbing his pack and checking his pistol's energy levels. Laura nodded, though her movements were still sluggish. "I'll keep up," she promised, her voice determined despite her exhaustion. Elias offered her his hand, and she took it without hesitation. With one final glance toward the canyon entrance, he pulled her to her feet. "Let's go." They moved quickly, staying low as they navigated the narrow paths along the canyon walls. The towering cliffs provided some cover, but the syndicate scouts were relentless. Elias knew they'd have drones in the sky, scanning for any signs of movement. Staying out in the open was not an option. As they made their way deeper into the canyon, a faint buzzing noise filled the air. A sound Elias recognized instantly. The tracking drone. It hovered somewhere above them, invisible against the bright sky, but its presence was unmistakable. "Get down," Elias hissed, pulling Leora into the shadows beneath a rocky overhang. They pressed themselves against the cool stone, holding their breath as the drone's hum grew louder, then slowly drifted away. Laura's hand clutched Elias' arm, her grip tight with fear. "They're close," she whispered. Elias nodded grimly. "We need to move faster." They continued their escape, winding through the maze-like canyon with Elias leading the way. Every turn felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential threat. But Elias' focus never wavered. He had made a promise to keep Leora safe, and he intended to keep it. The canyon gradually began to narrow, and the walls around them grew steeper. Elias knew they were running out of options. They needed to find a way out, fast. But as they rounded a corner, the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, sharp and deliberate. Elias' heart sank. The syndicate scouts were closing in. "We have to climb," he whispered to Leora, pointing to a rocky outcrop that led to a higher ridge. "Can you make it?" Leora's eyes flickered with determination. "Yes." Elias boosted her up first, watching as she nimbly scaled the rocks despite her weakened state. Once she was safely above, she reached down to help him up. Together, they scrambled to the top of the ridge, breathless but alive. The view from the ridge offered a brief moment of clarity and hope. In the distance, Elias spotted what looked like the remnants of an old outpost, half buried in sand, but still intact enough to offer shelter. There, he pointed, his voice low but urgent. If we can reach that outpost, we might stand a chance. Laura nodded, her gaze unwavering. Then let's go. They descended from the ridge as quickly as they dared, the sharp rocks cutting into their hands and knees. Behind them, the Syndicate scouts were still on their trail, their shouts growing louder with each passing moment. Elias pushed himself harder, adrenaline pumping through his veins. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him, but it also fueled his resolve. Leora was counting on him, and failure wasn't an option. Just as they reached the canyon's edge, a sudden burst of blaster fire exploded against the rocks beside them, sending shards of stone flying in every direction. Elias shielded Leora with his body, gritting his teeth against the searing heat of the blast. "They've spotted us," Leora gasped, panic rising in her voice. Elias grabbed her hand, pulling her forward with all the strength he had left. "Keep running," he shouted, his voice drowned out by the chaos around them. The outpost was tantalizingly close, just a few hundred meters away. But the Syndicate scouts were gaining ground, their shouts echoing across the desert. Elias fired a few shots over his shoulder, hoping to slow them down, but he knew it was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. Almost there, he urged Leora, his legs burning as they sprinted toward the outpost. With a final burst of effort, they reached the crumbling structure, ducking inside just as another volley of blaster fire rained down around them. Elias slammed the rusted door shut, his chest heaving with exhaustion. For a moment, there was only silence. The world outside seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the next move. Laura leaned against the wall, her breath ragged but steady. "We made it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. Elias nodded, though his mind was already racing. The outpost had bought them time, but it wouldn't keep them safe for long. The Syndicate scouts wouldn't stop until they were captured, or dead. "We need to find a way off this planet," Elias said, scanning the outpost's interior for anything useful. "There has to be a comm system here, if we can call for help." Before he could finish, Leora's hand brushed against his. "Thank you," she whispered, her violet eyes filled with gratitude. "And something more." Elias met her gaze, his heart pounding in his chest. For the first time, he allowed himself to believe that they might actually survive this. But the chase was far from over, and Elias knew that their journey had only just begun. Elias wasted no time as he scanned the outpost's crumbling interior. The walls were cracked, and most of the equipment lay in pieces, corroded by the desert winds. Yet there was still a glimmer of hope. An old communications console tucked in the far corner of the room, half buried beneath a tangle of wires and broken panels. "If this thing still works," Elias murmured, already pulling it free from the debris. Laura knelt beside him, her hands trembling but determined. She helped him untangle the mess of wires, her quick fingers showing more skill than Elias expected. "Do you think we can send a signal?" she asked quietly, her voice tinged with hope. "We don't have a choice," Elias replied, connecting power leads from his field generator to the console. The ancient machine sputtered to life with a soft hum, its flickering display casting dim light across the dusty room. Elias began tapping at the console, cycling through frequencies in search of an open channel. But every frequency was either dead or heavily encrypted. He cursed under his breath, wiping sweat from his brow. Time was running out. Laura leaned closer, her violet eyes reflecting the glow of the console's display. "I know some frequencies. My people used to communicate in secret channels. I could try." Elias nodded, stepping aside to let her work. Leora's delicate fingers danced across the controls, inputting a sequence of symbols Elias didn't recognize. After a moment, the console emitted a faint beep. A signal detected, faint but alive. This might work, Leora whispered, her voice filled with cautious optimism. Elias leaned in, activating the comms link. This is Captain Elias Voss of the Galactic Frontier Corps. We are stranded in the canyon sector of Marapai. Hostiles are in pursuit. If anyone can hear this, we need immediate extraction. He repeated the message, hoping, praying, that someone out there was listening. The console fell silent, leaving them in the heavy stillness of the outpost. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the console buzzed with static, and a voice, gravelly and distorted, came through. Copy, Frontier Corps. Signal weak. Extraction possible. 36 hours. Elias' heart sank. 36 hours. Far too long. The Syndicate would find them well before then. Understood, Elias replied grimly. We'll hold out until then. The transmission cut off, leaving Elias and Leora in silence once more. Leora exhaled slowly, her shoulders slumping as the weight of their situation settled over them. 36 hours, she whispered, shaking her head. They'll be here long before that. Elias clenched his fists, determination burning in his chest. Then we'll make sure they don't find us, he said firmly. We've made it this far. We're not giving up now. Leora looked at him, a flicker of admiration in her eyes. You really don't know when to quit, do you? Elias gave her a small, tired grin. Nope. Before they could share another word, a distant rumble echoed through the canyon, growing louder by the second. Elias tensed. That sound, he recognized it. Hovercraft engines. The Syndicate scouts were closing in. They're here, Leora whispered, her face pale. Elias grabbed her hand. We need to move. Now. They scrambled through the outpost, searching for anything useful. Elias found a rusted old rifle and slung it over his shoulder, while Leora unearthed a pack filled with rations and a few grenades. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Out the back, Elias said, leading Leora toward a narrow exit at the rear of the outpost. We'll head deeper into the canyon. It'll buy us time. They slipped out into the shadows just as the first Syndicate hovercraft roared past the front entrance, kicking up clouds of dust. Elias and Leora sprinted through the canyon, keeping low as they weaved between boulders and jagged rocks. The pursuit had begun again, and this time, the odds felt more daunting than ever. But Elias refused to give up. Not now, not when they were so close to freedom. As they ran, Leora glanced at him, her eyes filled with something Elias couldn't quite place. Hope, trust, and perhaps just the faintest spark of something deeper. For the first time in a long while, Elias felt like he wasn't running alone. And that made all the difference. The canyon narrowed into a labyrinth of twisting paths and jagged cliffs, every turn pulling Elias and Leora deeper into the desert's unforgiving landscape. They ran without stopping, their breath ragged, boots kicking up clouds of dust as they pressed onward. Behind them, the distant hum of Syndicate hovercrafts echoed like a death knell, closing in with terrifying speed. Elias glanced over his shoulder. They were running out of time and options. We'll lose them in the rocks, he said between gasps, pointing toward a cluster of narrow cliffs ahead. If we keep low, we can get to higher ground without being seen. Leora's steps faltered as exhaustion dragged her down, but she nodded determinedly. I can make it, she whispered, though her strength was waning. Elias knew she was close to her limit, but they didn't have the luxury to rest. Almost there, he reassured her. Just a little further. They scrambled over sharp rocks, the jagged edges tearing at their clothes and skin. The sound of engines grew louder behind them, followed by the distant bark of orders. Syndicate scouts coordinating their approach. They would be surrounded soon if they didn't find an escape route. Elias spotted a narrow crevice leading deeper into the cliffside, just wide enough for them to squeeze through. There, he shouted, pulling Leora toward the gap. The two of them ducked inside, their backs pressed against the cool stone as the shadows swallowed them whole. For a moment, they held their breath, listening as the syndicate hovercrafts roared past, unaware of their hiding place. Laura leaned against the rock wall, struggling to catch her breath. How long? Until they find us. Elias shook his head. Not long, but if we can reach higher ground, we might be able to hold them off, at least until help arrives. Laura's eyes met his, fear flickering behind her violet gaze. What if help doesn't come? Elias gave her a grim smile. Then we fight. They crawled through the narrow crevice, emerging on the other side to find themselves at the base of a steep cliff. The climb was daunting, but it was their only way out. Elias began the ascent first, helping Laura up whenever she faltered. Halfway up, the sound of boots on rock echoed below them. Syndicate soldiers. They were too late. The enemy had tracked them to the cliffside. Go, Laura, Elias urged, shoving her upward. I'll hold them off. No, she protested, but Elias gave her a determined look. I'll be right behind you, he promised. Now go. Reluctantly, Laura climbed higher, her slender hands grasping the jagged rocks. Elias turned to face the enemy, pulling the old rifle from his shoulder. The syndicate scouts appeared at the base of the cliff, their weapons drawn. Elias fired a shot, the blast echoing across the canyon. It wasn't a clean hit, but it was enough to force the scouts into cover. Come on, he muttered under his breath, firing another shot to buy Laura more time. The scouts returned fire, and Elias pressed himself against the rocks, narrowly avoiding the deadly blasts. He could feel the heat of the energy bolts as they hissed past, but he didn't flinch. He had faced worse odds before. Almost there, Laura called from above, her voice strained but determined. Elias risked a glance upward. She was near the top, pulling herself over the ledge with the last of her strength. Relief flooded through him, and he turned back to the scouts below. Time to end this. Elias pulled a grenade from his pack, yanked the pin free, and hurled it down toward the scouts. The explosion rocked the canyon, sending dust and debris flying in every direction. Go, Elias, Laura shouted, her hand reaching for him from the top of the cliff. With one last burst of effort, Elias climbed, his muscles burning with exhaustion. Just as the scouts began to recover from the blast, he reached the top, Laura grabbing his hand and pulling him over the edge. They collapsed together on the rocky plateau, gasping for air. The syndicate scouts were far below now, scrambling in the aftermath of the explosion. But Elias knew it wouldn't be long before they tried again. Laura turned to him, her eyes wide with gratitude and fear. We made it, she whispered, as if she couldn't quite believe it. Elias smiled, exhaustion and relief washing over him. We're not done yet, he said, his voice low but steady. But we've got a fighting chance. The hours stretched into eternity as Elias and Laura waited on the plateau, watching the desert below for any signs of the syndicate's next move. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. But as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, a distant rumble echoed through the sky. A sound Elias had been waiting for. A sleek rescue ship descended from the clouds, its engines humming as it touched down on the plateau. The door hissed open, and a squad of galactic frontier soldiers emerged, weapons drawn and ready. Elias helped Laura to her feet. Our ride's here, he said, a weary smile spreading across his face. The squad leader approached, scanning the horizon for any remaining threats. You must be Captain Voss, she said. We got your signal just in time. Let's get you both out of here. Laura hesitated, her gaze lingering on the desert below. What if the syndicate comes back? They won't, Elias promised, his voice firm. Not while I'm around. Laura looked at him, a soft smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Thank you, Elias, she whispered. For everything. Elias nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. "We're not done yet," he said, guiding her toward the rescue ship. "But we're not alone anymore." As they boarded the ship and the hatch sealed behind them, Elias allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The Syndicate might still be out there, but for now, they were safe. And for the first time in a long while, Elias felt that things were going to be okay. The ship's engines roared to life, lifting them off the plateau and into the endless sky. Leora sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, a silent reminder of the bond they had forged in the desert. Together, they had survived the impossible, and together, they would face whatever came next.